Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Wadier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Wadier, and I'm here as always with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey Scott, how are you?
Doing fantastic, my friend. Excited for today's conversation. We are going to be getting into cardiovascular and metabolic health and how fasting and adopting a fasting lifestyle is one of the best and biggest levers that you can pull to prevent, regain, and maintain health for the long term. So excited to have this conversation today with you, Tommy. Before we dive in, I want to welcome any of the new listeners. If you're new to the Fasting for Life podcast, welcome. I want to give
welcome.
I just want to give you a warm welcome in. Thanks for giving us a shot.
Yeah.
And adding us to your fasting journey. We are on this journey with you. If you want to know more how fasting was so transformational for Tommy and I, and how it transformed our lives and why we do what we do week in and week out on the pod with our 7-day challenges, with our coaching, with our resources, head back and listen to episode 0, episode 1. It gives you a little bit of perspective into why we do what we do. And since then, we are so grateful for so many 5-star reviews and likes and downloads and shares. So if you're a long-term listener, we appreciate you. And just a shout out to Sheena Q. This 5-star review came from May 14th,
All right.
2025. And the titled, "A Great Team. This show presents useful information." So,
Nice.
Sheena, honestly, if that was the only thing and the only takeaway that we heard from everyone, that would fill my bucket. That would be worth it.
Right.
So we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for taking the time to leave that 5-star review. Obviously, those are our favorite kind, and we are blessed to have so many.
Yeah,
that continues to tell the podcast world and others that might be looking for some help or some guidance or feeling like they're not on Fasting Island, that'll welcome them into the group. So happy to be on this journey with you, Tommy. Happy.
I hate Fasting Island.
Fasting Island, man.
Sucks.
First 2 rules of fasting. We haven't said this a while on the pod. Don't talk about fasting and don't talk about fasting.
Right.
Unless, of course, you're in one of our Facebook communities, coaching groups, and you have a like-minded group of folks. Thankfully, over the years, fasting has become more accepted, and the research has shown that it is an absolutely viable tool, sometimes better tool, for weight loss and sustaining weight loss, in our opinion. Obviously, we're biased because of the results we've gotten and the thousands of testimonials and messages that we get year after year. But yeah, fasting's powerful. So Tommy, let's get into it today and talk about a starting point when we're talking about metabolic health and cardiovascular health. I want to come from a starting point today in why people ultimately come to fasting.
Okay.
So
Usually weight loss, right?
Yeah, pretty much. That's it. So why do people come to fasting? Well, they come to fasting because they ultimately want to lose weight. And is that a bad thing inherently? No, absolutely not. Because we know that being at an ideal weight and an ideal body composition is going to allow your body to heal and function to obtain health. The first 4 letters of the word health are heal. Right? Some fasting has so many powerful benefits way beyond weight loss, and we'll talk about that today. But the reality is that inherently the weight itself is not bad. It's the long-term environment and the lifestyle that comes with keeping that weight on year after year, decade after decade, that leads to chronic lifestyle and metabolic dysfunction, ultimately cardiovascular disease, comorbidities, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancers, you name it. Insulin is linked or at the root of 8 of the top 10 reasons for all-cause mortality here in the States. So we want to focus on this from a standpoint that fasting is a tool. It's a vehicle to get you there. we don't want to just lose the weight. We want to maintain the weight and ultimately get the health and metabolic and healing and longevity benefits of being in that optimal state. Because most people are told to lose weight, or they inherently know they should lose some weight, right?
Yeah, like it'll probably be beneficial for them.
Right. Might be a conversation with a doctor, might be, a personal choice, a personal journey, but we know that inherently we should be at a healthy weight and, in our opinion, more of a healthy body composition for optimal function. But the reality is the motivating factor typically comes from a very allopathic standpoint where we are going to look at, say, a lab metric or a cholesterol number, or we like to look at different metrics like waist circumference or waist to height ratio, which indicate insulin resistance, or HOMA-IR. And we'll talk about some of that stuff and how it links to cardiovascular health and metabolic health in today's conversation. But if we're starting with that starting point of, I need to lose some weight because my markers are off, or I don't want to go on a medication, or I don't want to be on a medication long term, we need to really have a shift in focus of why we fast, which goes a lot farther than just simply losing weight, if that makes sense.
It definitely does. And I love to highlight a lot of folks aren't necessarily coming to fasting just for the weight loss or as their primary goal too, right? And so here's a cool subset that we know of and we hear from oftentimes, which is, hey, I'm not necessarily at my ideal weight, but I really don't care about the weight. What I would like to do is balance that blood work, like you said. Like I have a few markers that are a bit off. And so this was me. I was less concerned back when I had probably 25 pounds, 30 pounds to lose. I was less concerned with that if I could just get a hold of what was going on with my liver enzymes ticking up and my blood pressure starting to get like 10, 15, 18 points kind of up, every once in a while, like 25% of the time I would have like normal range blood pressure readings. But then the other 75%, it was 10 to 15 points higher. And it was like, I know I would like better numbers there. I would like my body to be operating better. But here's the thing. As long as, if that's the goal, knowing that as the weight comes off, those are much more likely to get back into balance. Or if you're tracking those numbers and then they're coming back down, or they're getting back to where they should be, that the weight is likely to be coming off too. And maybe not all the way, but at the same time, they're so highly correlated that you usually don't have one without the other. So understanding that if your primary goal is not fat loss, that it might be happening anyway if you're looking for something else from your fasting transformation, let's say.
Yeah, and there are, and I mean, I came to fasting initially because I was struggling with figuring out why my metabolic function wasn't improving, yet I was doing all of the right things, eating less, moving more. Hired a world-renowned functional nutritionist here in Houston, did 6 months with him before I found my fasting insulin number, and we'll talk about some labs, was out of whack, and that was driving insulin resistance, and I was a slow oxidizer, and carbohydrates were not allowing me to get off the roller coaster of the weight loss journey. And the reality here is, there's one other category of folks too, is that they want to use fasting to help with X, Y, or Z, meaning they have a thyroid issue, they have a chronic lifestyle condition, they are pre-diabetic, where the pain of change is less than the pain of staying the same, where they get to that point where they know they have to do something, right?
Right.
And they're like, well, I've been trying doing it in the allopathic model. I've been trying to manage it, based on the medication or the recommendation, but I just haven't been able to move the needle, and I'm not feeling great. And I would really like help to either, manage or reverse or improve the current metabolic state that I'm in, right? So fasting goes well beyond just to lose weight, right? That's just the beginning. So a couple of things about beyond the scale, so to speak, or the metabolic switch is we want to train the body to be able to shift from constantly relying on glucose or sugar and start tapping into those fat stores to burn ketones, right? So the switch, that weight loss switch, that metabolic switch, doesn't just help with weight loss, but it also triggers a cascade of other health promoting changes to the body. I'm just going to rattle them off, and then we'll get into the cardiovascular and metabolic health focus. But the health benefits go far beyond weight loss. So when it comes to fasting and ultimately losing weight, blood sugar and insulin regulation, right? So it reduces insulin resistance, stabilizes blood sugar, lowers the risk of type 2 diabetes, actually allows for the reversal of, in the case of my dad and so many others that we've helped. It has a direct connection to blood pressure and cholesterol and triglycerides and cardiovascular risk. We've done dozens and dozens of articles comparing fasting versus non-fasting control groups and studies that show the benefits. Brain and cognitive function, enhances mental clarity, supports brain health, inflammation and cellular repair, reduces chronic inflammation, stimulates repair and DNA protection. And in animal and human studies, fasting can extend your lifespan and lower the risk of chronic diseases, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular diseases, even some cancers. And the reality is the power of fasting is really a natural health tool or a holistic health tool. And it's been around since the dawn of time, right? It can be a spiritual experience for some. It can be part of your religion. It's so much more vast than just simply not eating or restricting when you're going to be making those food choices. Yeah. So the power of fasting goes so much farther than just that silly little number on the scale. And we dedicate a whole day to this during our 7-day Master Your Fasting challenges, where we talk about the scale and the trickiness of it, and the fact that it's probably the lowest level on the tier of importance when it comes to the motivating factor on what you're doing and how it can derail you. So we try to put the scale in its place, and today we're really going to focus on that cardiovascular component and that metabolic component and how it's related to blood sugar, contributing, unbalanced blood sugar or insulin contributing to those chronic disease processes or those comorbidities or the cardiovascular disease, et cetera.
Yeah, because so I remember, let's go back in the time machine, maybe like 20 years ago or so. And we were starting to hear these terms like cardiometabolic health and cardiometabolic disease. And it wasn't just type 2 diabetes. Now it was becoming like metabolic syndrome.
Yep.
And all of these kind of terms started to connect from one body system to the other. Whereas prior to that, and over so many years, it's been as compartmentalized as possible within modern medicine, when you could take one body system and just treat this one little thing that was going on and then assume that you'd be able to fix the problem. Like it was just one little link in the chain, and if you could just fix that link, the whole chain would be working again. But what we started to understand better and better, and still are, is the inner workings between the different body systems. And when we think about metabolism, most of us, especially if you have a history with trying to lose weight, we normally are thinking of our basal metabolic rate or our total daily energy expenditure, and what does my caloric deficit look like so that I can hopefully melt off some of this fat that I want to lose, right?
You had mentioned that. Yeah, absolutely. And that's to the point of kind of the jumping off point for today's conversation is you mentioned metabolic syndrome, right? So that's three of the following things: abdominal obesity, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high serum triglycerides, and low serum HDL lipoprotein. So we're talking about labs and metrics and cholesterol panels, right? So it's the fact that we have this, we're trying to solve for X in a mindset or a framework that really isn't about the actual solving for X. It's about the isolation of one thing that's broken, and then we're going to treat or manage that one thing. When we're looking at the whole system in terms of how complex metabolic health is and how complex cardiovascular issues are, the reality is the study that came out from the University of North Carolina in 2021, and I think it was actually released in 2018, but it really came to light during the COVID years, is that 88% of the country is metabolically unfit. If we look at the populations that COVID, ultimately a major respiratory issue and respiratory infection, in most folks, that's the populations that it hit the worst, was the folks that were struggling with the metabolic syndrome, that were carrying that extra weight,
Mm.
year after year, decade after decade. The people that had that dysfunction, that underlying metabolic issue, they're the ones that sadly were the most affected.
Right. And it starts to make sense when you draw these lines between respiratory and cardiovascular efficiency, and when putting a major tax on the system like that, like during the
Right.
COVID times, and then how does the body respond to it? Well, if you had extra capacity, then you may have responded very well to it. If you didn't have extra capacity because there was already additional stress on all of the body systems with the extra weight, then your body probably had a harder time dealing with that.
Right.
And in a lot of different ways that came about. So when we get back to drawing the connection points between metabolic health and cardiovascular disease and cardiometabolic health, it's like how did the heart and metabolism, how did they start getting linked together like this? And why are we seeing so many things now that are tracking things like heart rate variability,
Yes.
resting heart rate, and
VO2 max.
VO2 max. And these are things that we used to hear about just for performance athletes before.
Right.
But now we understand them better as very, very much earlier markers of overall health for all of us mere mortals, for all of the general population, right?
Yeah, and so the connection here, we'll go into cardiometabolic health in just a minute, and its connection to metabolism, metabolic function. I don't like the word metabolism, metabolic function, and then ultimately what we do with fasting to pull those levers. When we look at it, we really focus primarily here, and in what we do is in the central role of insulin at the core. So insulin is what allows your body to, and whenever you say insulin, people think diabetes, right? But that is a very long-term thing that starts much earlier on and then eventually shows up in the later decades of life.
Oh, that's a great point. Hold on. Because when you think back to metabolic syndrome, what I want everyone to understand is that it's not like a virus. Like, will I get this or won't I get this? And yes or no. It's not a black and white thing. It's an underlying slow build of a process that's generally seen or diagnosed or better understood much later in life. But if you could go back, the earlier that you can just go, you know what? Yeah, one or two or three of these things are starting to happen.
Yep.
And these are like the very tip of the iceberg for later development of metabolic syndrome.
Right.
Then I can understand that. I can do something about it way before it gets to like my doctor's radar, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we want to be.
And this is the whole point. This is my own personal journey as well. Is my liver enzymes are elevated. My central weight gain was there. My sleep was off. My blood pressure was starting to creep up. My triglycerides were elevated, even though I was eating clean.
Yep.
So the reality is, it's kind of like rust on a bumper. If you were to just put a bumper in a bucket of water, like a car bumper, a metal bumper, and you put it in water, and then you come back a week later, and you're like, oh yeah, the bumper's fine. Right? But if you leave it there for 30 years, you're going to come back and be like, what the heck was that? You couldn't even identify that it was a bumper.
Yep.
So these changes take place and they kind of build slowly beneath the surface. And this is why we have 25% of the population that has metabolic syndrome. So 3 of those 5, abdominal obesity, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high serum triglycerides, and low HDL. And why we have 80 million Americans, between 70 and 80 million Americans that are undiagnosed pre-diabetics, because their A1C and their fasting blood sugar is still in the air quotes normal range, by no means optimal. And they don't know that they have this thing developing beneath the surface. And this is where insulin's role comes in. And this is why we focus on insulin, and fasting insulin is such an early indicator of future problems. Waist circumference indicates insulin potential for insulin resistance, because that metabolic switch isn't able to flip because insulin is high. It's still managing your blood sugar and keeping it in those normal ranges, but it's slowly needing more and more and more and more. So by not testing fasting insulin, we're doing a huge disservice and just allowing the bumper in the water to just rust, rather than taking the bumper out of the water and drying it off, right? I know it's might not be the perfect analogy, But chronically high insulin leads to the insulin resistance. It's the kind of the iceberg analogy. It's the thing beneath the surface that ultimately increases your chance of metabolic syndrome and increased cardiovascular risk. So fasting is way more sensitive early marker for metabolic dysfunction, and HOMA-IR, which is the gold standard for insulin resistance, the equation for insulin resistance, than just a fasting blood glucose or an A1C. So the problem, again, is you're operating in a model that looks at those things and you get your yearly blood work, and then all of a sudden, boom, you've got a trigger, or boom, you've crossed the line, and now you're sitting in a state going, what the heck happened? I thought I was doing everything right.
Wow.
So fasting is the powerful tool, the lever that will reduce insulin the quickest, improve the effectiveness of insulin, and then ultimately reduces the insulin resistance. Some studies that we've gone over, even without significant weight loss. To your point earlier, Tommy, that it's not ultimately about the weight, it's about the underlying function that we want to stabilize.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point too, because think back, if you have any amount of weight that you want to take off, which most
especially if it's centrally located, that visceral adiposity, right?
Great point. If you go back, if it happened over a long enough period of time, then you would normally see not just an immediate, hey, one day I didn't have this symptom, like, this blood work, this liver enzyme ticking up, or this slightly higher blood pressure. It wasn't all just from one day to the next. It just happened. It didn't like flip a switch and happen. Usually it was a small gradual kind of transition that you may or may not have noticed. And so the same thing can happen a bit in reverse when you start fasting, especially if it starts working for you in the beginning, but then things can kind of slow down. That can be a little bit frustrating, but that's only because we develop a level of impatience once we see that it's working, and then it stops working so quickly. So sometimes that can be a demotivating factor too. So I wanted to highlight the fact that it's often good to remind yourself that you didn't put those few pounds on, or those 50 pounds on, or whatever the number is. You didn't put them on overnight. They're not going to come off overnight.
Right.
And also your symptoms and your blood work didn't get imbalanced overnight too.
Right.
So even if the scale's not moving, but it feels like you're doing things right and you're doing things differently from before, you could still be reaping a physiological benefit that's taking time, just like the bumper. It's almost the bumper analogy, but in reverse, where it's taking time to get back to normal.
And that's why we talk about fasting for life, that this is a lifestyle adaptation. It's not just another diet. It's not just another weight loss approach. Right. That's why we call it fasting for life. And I fast now to continue to work on the visceral fat, that central fat that I've gained over the years through the lifestyle and the restaurant business and the grad school and the late nights and the lack of sleep and
high stress, low sleep, late eating.
Low sleep. Yeah. Right.
Perfect storm.
It is a perfect storm. So let's talk a little bit about cardiovascular health, and then we'll relate it to glycemic variability and ultimately metabolic function, and why fasting is so powerful. Because if we look at cardiovascular disease, which is the #1 cause of death here in the United States, over 700,000 people every single year die from cardiovascular disease. The umbrella that's out there right now is that a lot of folks look at the association of the buildup of plaque and cholesterol and other substances in the arteries, even in the skeletal muscle. And then you get plaque, you get atherosclerosis, air quotes, clogging of the arteries. The arteries narrow, makes it harder for blood pressure, for blood to get through, ultimately raising your blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, et cetera. And when we're looking at this, the problem is that when we look at people that have no or mild symptoms when it comes to cardiovascular disease, more than 42% of people with coronary artery disease that's been diagnosed, they also have the issue in the periphery, so in the peripheral arteries.
Yeah.
So
because it's not a localized heart problem.
Yes, it's a systemic issue.
That's part of the issue with just the term cardiovascular disease.
Right.
Most of us think of it as almost like an anatomical heart problem, but it really has nothing to do with that. It's usually much more widespread than that. And
then we have the cerebrovascular part of it, which is the whole stroke component, right? Two main types. There's the ischemic stroke, which is blockage based. But then there's the hemorrhagic stroke, which is more of that chronic inflammatory bleeding of the brain type subset of cardiovascular disease.
Right.
And many people think, and we started the conversation with this, that You come to fasting because you're worried about the cholesterol or the LDL, and that being the ultimate cause of heart disease. Yeah, cholesterol is a factor, and then we can talk about LPA and lipoprotein B, and we have a optimal lab guide in the show notes if you want to go grab it. And then we talk about things like CRP, which is C-reactive protein, which is a systemic inflammatory marker, because it's not cholesterol inherently that's bad. It's the oxidation of cholesterol, right, that leads to those cardiovascular issues.
Yeah. Do you remember when CRP used to be talked about as like the heart marker?
Yeah.
It was like this could tell you what's going on with your heart before it's a problem. And again, this was like 20 years ago. But essentially understanding it now as a generalized inflammatory marker of what's going on within a lot of processes within the body is much, much more helpful. But there's some of that dissociation that we need to be making if we're thinking about these things kind of in the wrong way, much like heart rate variability and resting heart rate for performance wise. No, like these are longevity metrics now.
They are. So resting heart rate below 100, right? Healthy heart, blood pressure 120/80, respiration rate 12 to 18 breaths. This is the one that has become much more prevalent, and this is the heart rate recovery, or the HRV rate, right? Mm-hmm. Heart rate variability, HRV, and then VO2 max. So This is something that Dr. Peter Attia in his book Outlive, and he talks a lot about these longevity metrics, because we now know that these are the things that we should be looking at to prevent the low and slow kind of beneath the surface build that happens. Then all of a sudden you trip over the tripwire, and now you have the thing on the lab that's out of whack, or the symptom, or the condition, or the thing that you ultimately don't want. So when we look at cardiovascular health and how it's related to metabolic health, poor metabolic health puts you at risk for these things that we've talked about: heart disease, stroke, heart attack, heart failure, right? And here's the reality and we're going to talk about this in related to glucose and insulin here before we wrap up with some action steps today, is for every 1% increase in A1C, HbA1c, which is the gold standard for looking at where you are on the blood sugar, diabetes kind of progression. Mm-hmm. For every 1% increase in A1C levels, your chance of having a heart problem, dying from a heart problem, or being hospitalized for heart failure increases by 12%.
Wow.
The risk of a major cardiovascular event like a stroke or a heart attack increases by 8%. And the risk of having heart-related kidney issues increases by 17%.
And this is like going from, let's say, a 5.5 to a 6.5 on the A1C,
correct,
right? So, and that's your 90-day moving average of your blood sugar levels. So this is directly connecting your blood sugar levels and what's happening on an hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute, day-to-day basis within your blood sugar to your overall health span and longevity and risk factors for all of these comorbidities.
Exactly. And when we tie this back to insulin and blood sugar, we want to talk about the role of glycemic variability, not necessarily just a fasting blood glucose, but how the swings between the highs and the lows of your blood sugar. For optimal health, you should be having managed cortisol response, your stress response, your HPA axis response, managed blood sugar, and managed insulin response. So if you think about it, going back to math class, and you had the sine and cosine waves, like the waves, the ups and downs, the peaks and valleys, that area under the curve, we want to see a good glycemic variability so that your body doesn't have to overproduce insulin, promote insulin resistance, and ultimately metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, like we've mentioned. So if you look at the diabetic group, and they have the greatest glycemic variability, the biggest peaks and valleys, they're 2.5 times higher risk of developing heart disease compared to a group, the control group, with the lowest variability. This was a 2023 meta-analysis.
Wow.
So if we can decrease your glycemic variability, switch those peaks and valleys down to where your body is more responsive from an insulin standpoint, from an insulin sensitivity standpoint, then you're going to be massively decreasing your risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and heart disease, et cetera.
Wow. I mean, and this is exactly how you logically start connecting cardio and metabolic right here.
Yes.
Metabolic is literally your processing and transformation of energy, bringing it into the body and turning it into different usable things within the body, and then letting go of the byproducts, right? So that's literally metabolism at a 30,000 foot view. And if you take your cardiovascular risk and all of these risk factors, and you start tying them together, you can see how your blood sugar and blood sugar variability leads to your insulin response, insulin variability, insulin load, average fasting insulin, and then these directly lead over to your risk factors in your cardiovascular system. And so this is really, really important. And we saw a study, and this was back from 2010, where they took 1,500 individuals across different weights, different BMIs, different risk factors and things like that. And they just looked, what was their C-reactive protein? What was their CRP levels? And then what was their insulin and their insulin resistance using HOMA-IR, the gold standard for insulin resistance. And what they saw was that if CRP levels were high, like in the highest quartile or in the highest tertile, like when you broke it down for a population, when they were in the higher levels, then they had a 2 to 3 times more likely was their chance of having elevated or having insulin resistance, excuse me. So CRP was highly correlated with higher insulin resistance. And so the connections here is not necessarily causation, and that's not what the study is implying or anything along those lines. But to understand that there's a strong correlation here is really important, because then that helps the cognitive dissonance, which would be, well, I have a strong heart, or I don't usually have, I don't feel like I have breathing or heart issues or whatever. They did a check on my heart. It looks good. So that's great. But underlying inflammatory markers that lead to systemic problems across your cardiovascular system that's what we're talking about here. And so understanding that those are two very different things. One's like the acute problem, and one is the more long-term chronic problem that develops, like the rust on a bumper.
Yeah, and I'll go over the mechanisms here, just superficially, just 30,000 foot view here in just a second. But we don't want to forget that whole cardiovascular fitness and metabolic health connection either.
Yeah.
And this is where we mentioned VO2 max earlier. And there was a study in 2018, 51 people overweight or obese with various levels of glucose tolerance find that A1C accounts for 19% of the variation in VO2 max.
Wow.
So the VO2 max is much, much lower in the pre-diabetic and the overweight obese category. So that is, as fasting blood sugar levels increase, your insulin resistance goes up over time, your function of your endothelial cells, the cells that line the blood vessels, decreases.
And that's irrespective of weight too.
Correct.
That's when you take this same, you could take a 200-pound male or 150-pound female or any other line in the sand there, and then just compare A1C, normalizing for the weight, and then you see that 19% accounted for in the VO2 max. That's really, really important to understand. And that goes back to the previous point of, like, the weight's not always, the necessary change. Sometimes it is, sometimes it is correlated, but it's not always the case for everybody.
So let's talk about the mechanisms and how they relate to glycemic variability, blood sugar, ultimately insulin resistance.
Okay.
So if we're going to look, you already mentioned one is chronic inflammation, right? So insulin resistance, high blood sugar, obesity, a high GI diet, so a very high refined, processed, carb, convenient-based food choice diet, the standard American diet, so to speak, is going to create a chronic low-grade level of inflammation. And inflammation is the primary way that glucose variability contributes to heart problems. And there are two main factors. The first is the accumulation of oxidized cholesterol. So we talked about that plaque model, right? And then the second is the chronic inflammatory response on the blood vessel cells themselves, those endothelial cells, which is where we'll see that ticking up of the blood pressure because the function has gone down. So the subset of that inflammatory conversation is also going to be the mechanism of oxidative stress. So when there's not enough antioxidants in the body and high blood sugar or high glucose variability, those big blood sugar swings, we're going to have a more production of those reactive oxygen species, or that oxidative stress. That's where we start to get into the organ tissue damage from pre-diabetic and diabetes. Lower oxidative stress is related to glycemic variability than high blood sugar in itself. So when we look at oxidative stress, it's going to have a direct effect on insulin's ability to function. It's going to have the indirect effect on suppression of nitric oxide, which is a messenger that regulates blood flow and arteries' ability to narrow and widen. So now we're looking at the underlying, the beneath the surface things, the mechanisms of why we ultimately see higher cardiovascular risk and heart disease in diabetics long term. Because this is the thing that's going on beneath the surface. This is the thing that's going on that's allowing the plaques to form. When we look at fasting, right, when we look at how the biggest lever that we can pull is, well, if we know that this is related to blood sugar variability, glycemic variability is another way to say it, we've mentioned it a few times today, or getting control over that, then we need to look at insulin. What's the easiest way to reduce the insulin load, decrease inflammation, increase cognitive function, increase BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor? So many times do we hear, Tommy, that when I stay consistent with my fasting and I'm making a few better food choices, I just feel less inflamed.
Right.
I feel better. My clothes fit better. My joints don't hurt as much.
Yeah, no Tylenol, no aspirin. All these
I'm
kind of things.
sleeping better.
Yep. I mean, inflammation, underlying chronic pain, just like pain in the joints can be such a disruptor for sleep. That's such a big one.
Oh, yeah.
Then you wake up the next day, you had less sleep. That lower sleep, we've talked about it recently on the podcast, which leads to the next day you're having insulin resistance that following day after sleep deprivation, quote unquote. And it doesn't have to be extreme deprivation, but really disrupting that can be a problem. Then it's harder to set your next timer. It's harder to stick to your next fast. You're less likely to make good food choices that next day. So, I mean, literally, just like we're talking about these things going on in the body within different processes, they're not acting in silos here. They're connected links in a chain, the same way that your fasting lifestyle is links in a chain as well.
So what are the main levers outside of fasting that you can pull? Right? Fasting is going to be the main lever to decrease that insulin load and get that blood sugar variability down, right? So giving you more stable blood sugar. You can follow, we love low carb. We love an anti-inflammatory type diet, not your standard American diet that we mentioned, the high processed, high convenient foods, the highly palatable foods. You can focus on getting more antioxidants in. You can really focus on managing that blood sugar response, doing the things that we talk about when you break a fast or start a fast, or using apple cider vinegar or walking post-meal. Postprandial walks have been shown to decrease blood sugar, prioritizing sleep so you don't have that increased craving, increased hunger, decreased blood glucose regulation that following day. So when we adopt it to a fasting lifestyle, we always say if you're going to start a longer fast, or don't use fast as preparation for going off the rails or reparations for something you did with your food choices. But when we're looking at fasting as the lever, making those more intentional food choices, prioritizing protein, knowing that if you're going to start a longer fast, don't go and indulge the night before with high carb laden processed refined foods, alcohol, because then the next day you're going to have that much harder of a time sticking to your fasting windows because you've increased that variability. So your underlying physiology is going, hey, what'd you do here? This sucks. Don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And ultimately the consistency is key, right? The fact that if we can hit singles day over day, week over week, and we can hit that 80% rule, so 24 out of the 30 days every month, that we can hit 80%, that the consistency is key here to ultimately decrease the chance of cardiovascular risk, metabolic syndrome, and all of those mechanisms, those underlying inflammatory, oxidative, vascular issues that we talked about. It all comes back to blood sugar regulation, insulin sensitivity, and making sure that we're continuing to see the scale move down over time, but that irrespective of the scale, that we still know by doing this, we're going to get those metabolic benefits.
You mentioned all these things that you can do that help support your fasting lifestyle. The cool thing is those could all be done without fasting, and you would get a benefit from them. You would get reduced inflammation. You would get reduced cardiovascular, cardiometabolic risk factors. You would get an increase in health span, lifespan, all of these important things. You're more likely to have more balanced blood work and a better, more stable weight and control over the scale. So that's really good. But you can supercharge all of these things by combining them with consistent fasting. And when I say that, I'm not thinking about necessarily ultra long fast or anything like that, but in a way that you can integrate daily consistent fasting would be much more important. Because like you said, even if you know you're going to start a longer fast, or, hey, maybe it's a 24-hour fast, or maybe it's a 48-hour fast. And if you looked at that dinner going into that as an opportunity to I gotta get all the stuff in, and it becomes more of an indulgent time. The tricky part there is that's one more time that you led your body into very these large spikes and large volatility within your blood sugar and your insulin response, and that's one more of those times where you increased all of the inflammatory factors by multiple fold. And now it's going to take additional time to come back into balance, right? And so you take all of those times where it's that decision versus the decision to take a post-meal walk, to take some apple cider vinegar to help control the blood sugar spike, to make one better food choice today, to take something and make a food swap so that it's a bit lower in processed foods or processed ingredients. It's a bit healthier. So when you do all of these things, think about it as one small decision after another, rather than needing to change everything and do everything perfectly. Each one of those small decisions adds up. Yeah. And that's the cool contrast, because if everybody knows people who are in better health than they are, and usually if we compare ourselves to them and we go, okay, what are they doing? A lot of times it looks like they're doing everything right, and we know all the things that we're doing wrong, at least some of the time. But usually there's less, if you ask them, hey, what are the things, like what are the keys to your success? Usually they're gonna tell you in a way that feels much more similar to what you're doing, just a few small things, and it's gonna end up showing up as consistency rather than they're doing everything perfectly all the time. It's just that they're showing up making these small decisions more consistently, day in and day out, most of the time. They're not getting it right all the time, but it's that consistency over time that leads to the dramatic difference in results. So keeping that in mind, we can start integrating all of these things that we're talking about today.
100%. So if you're looking for more support, if you're looking for some more consistency in your fasting, head to the show notes. Grab our lab guide, our optimal lab range guide. Grab our blueprint to fasting for fat loss. Join a 7-day challenge where we talk about all of the physiology and how we implement these things. We talk so much more about the habit lifestyle change during those than we actually do the fasting times, et cetera, et cetera. But when we started today's conversation, we're tackling the misconception, and this isn't for everybody, that fasting is just about losing weight. Sure, that's where most people start. But the science shows fasting is a powerful tool for metabolic health, brain function, heart protection, and even longevity.
Right, so, which is why you can use it as a long-term maintenance sustainability tool too.
Right, so we always say begin with the end in mind, right? So fasting's so much more about the number on the scale and the weight loss. It's more about that metabolic benefit that you're getting. So if you're looking for more guidance, you can head to the show notes. You can reach out to us. Hopefully today was kind of a big picture overview of why we focus so much on insulin and blood sugar control and how it relates to those ultimate things that we want to improve upon. We come to fasting for weight loss, but it is so much more than that, Tommy. So I appreciate the conversation today, man. If you're looking for more support, head to the show notes, grab a resource, reach out, set those fasting timers. And as always, I appreciate the conversation. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye.
So, you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.